How Good is Good Enough, Chapter 5. Didn't Mo know? While I was in graduate school in Dallas, I lived in a pretty rough area of the city. Walking distance from my efficiency apartment, there was a dry cleaner managed by a wonderful old lady named Phyllis. From time to time, I was able to engage Phyllis in conversations that went beyond the recent exploits of the Cowboys or the Rangers. On one occasion, I mentioned how often I felt unsafe in my own neighborhood. One thing led to another, and before long we were talking about death and heaven and angels and all kinds of stuff that neither of us knew much about. As I was leaving, Phyllis made a final comment that caused me to stop and turn around. "If something were to happen to me," she said, "I know I would go to heaven." "Really?" I said. "Why's that?" "Because I keep the 10 Commandments," she said. Well, that struck me as strange. "Phyllis, do you even know the 10 Commandments?" She smiled and sheepishly admitted that she knew a few of them. "Do you know where in the Bible the 10 Commandments are found?" I asked. "Nope," she said, "but I sure as hell don't break any of them." Look for yourself. Phyllis knew there were some laws somewhere in the Bible, and she assumed, as many do, that there is some connection between those laws and where a person spends eternity. But the fact is, there is no connection between the 10 Commandments and heaven. None. Nada. Zero. It doesn't exist. You don't have to take my word for it. You can pick up a Bible and check it out for yourself. The 10 Commandments are found in the book of Exodus. Interesting book. But there is no promise of heaven for people who keep the 10 Commandments. There is no mention anywhere in Exodus of the afterlife or eternal bliss. In fact, the dearth of writings by Moses pertaining to the afterlife led at least one powerful segment of Jewish religious leaders, the Sadducees, to not believe in the afterlife at all. These Jewish scholars, men who spent their entire lives studying the scriptures, arrived at the conclusion that keeping the 10 Commandments in no way guaranteed a person anything beyond this life, and this is the same list of do's and don'ts that many are depending upon to get them into heaven. The list goes on. If you read the entire book of Exodus, you will discover that there aren't just 10 commandments. There are dozens of commandments, most of which none of us have kept. And not only are there lots of commandments, but many come with specific consequences attached. In Exodus 21:17, just a few verses removed from God's top 10 list, it says, "Anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death." A bit extreme for my taste, but if you are really serious about hanging your eternity on your ability to keep the Old Testament commandments, you've got to adopt the whole system, not just the parts that are convenient. "Thou shalt not murder" doesn't threaten my lifestyle too much, but "thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house" hits a little closer to home, especially if that includes furnishings. My point? Don't look to the Bible, certainly not the Old Testament, for a list of things to do to ensure your place in heaven. The standard is too high. Besides, you have to sacrifice a bull or cow or pigeon to get right with God every time you break a commandment. The 10 Commandments are part of a complicated system of laws and sacrifices. Trust me, you don't have the time or the facilities to embrace everything necessary to approach God that way. So if the 10 Commandments weren't given as a means of earning our way to heaven, what was their purpose? What's the point? The Old Testament law was given primarily to provide a social and civil framework for the nation of Israel. Just as we have laws that govern our city, so Israel needed laws to live by. When Moses showed up, the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They had no laws or a system of government. Slaves don't need that sort of thing. Once they were free from Egypt, all of that changed, so God gave his people a system of rules to live by that were in keeping with the way he thought people should conduct themselves. But nowhere did he promise heaven for those who kept the law, and nowhere did he threaten hell for those who didn't. In fact, God didn't expect Israel to keep the law perfectly. That's why he prescribed the elaborate system of sacrifices. On several occasions, the people of Israel ignored God's law and adopted the laws of surrounding nations. When Israel got off track, God sent prophets to warn the people. But even when Israel chose to ignore God's warnings, never did he threaten to abandon his people or send them to hell. Again, there seemed to be no eternal ramifications to keeping or breaking God's law. Consequences? Yes, but never the promise of hell or the threat of, never the promise of heaven or the threat of hell. Falling down. Unlike the Old Testament, which seemingly ignores issues of eternity, the New Testament is full of stuff about heaven and hell. But once again, we find no help in our quest for a standard by which we can earn favor with God. Here's what the New Testament says about working our way into heaven. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is no one righteous, not even one. For the wages of sin is death. And check this one out. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. It's one of my favorites, actually. The New Testament comes right out and says what the Old Testament implies. No one will reach God by being good. I'm not arguing that the Bible is correct. I'm just pointing out that the Bible offers no help in our quest to find a magic list. Not only does the Bible not offer any help, it discourages us from even looking. Dun, dun, dun. Chapter 6 is next.